black people's dollars making sense back then when it comes to business ownership, which we know is one of the foundational approaches to wealth building. And Booker T cited in this book Cincinnati. And I'll just read this to you. He says, much enterprise has been shown by Mr. William M. Porter of Cincinnati, Ohio. He was born a slave in Tennessee in 1850 and was well grown before opportunities for education came to him. At the end of the war, he went to Cincinnati and hired out as a hackman, working in this capacity for 10 years. At the end of this time, he went into the undertaking business and married Miss Davis, a school teacher in public schools of Cincinnati, to whose efforts and judgment much of his success is due. Booker T ended by saying for more than 20 years, he was the only colored undertaker in Cincinnati and used his monopoly so well that his real estate holdings in Cincinnati amount to about $25,000, to say nothing of the value of his horses and rolling stock. All throughout this book, Booker T cited black folks who were in business. He went around the country and just made notes and talked to people and put it all in this book about black people who had started their business enterprises and who were doing quite well. Which brings me to 1986, when there was an article in Inc. magazine titled "The Reluctant Entrepreneurs." The Reluctant Entrepreneurs. Less than 100 years, about 100 years, no, let's see. Yeah, less than 100 years after Booker T wrote his book, we have an article titled "The Reluctant Entrepreneurs," and of course it's talking about black people. And it really speaks to how things changed from the time of the National Negro Business League in Booker T. Washington's time, and I would say on through the 1920s, 1930s, and 40s when it came to black business ownership. It showed how radically things had changed in terms of business ownership and support of those businesses. Now, I've gone through this many times on this show about how we walked away from our own businesses in the 60s because now we had our civil rights and we were privileged to go and spend our money with someone else. And a lot of our businesses closed. So we don't need to revisit that. We know how that took place. But this article, The Reluctant Entrepreneurs, points out a lot of different aspects of the what can I say? Not reluctance, but the paucity or the lack of black businesses in this country now as compared to back, like they say, in the day. It's a pretty long article, but there are a couple of things I wanted to point out in this, again, to set this whole thing up, because we're going to bring it home locally. You know, we always apply it to what's going on here locally. And I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs from this for you too. This says, after integration, a lot of blacks got into the system and made it, says Atlanta florist Alice Bussey, past president of the predominantly black Atlanta Business League. But now they have become so individualized that they forget they are supposed to be active in the community. That's why we're not as cohesive as we need to be. Sound familiar? Sound familiar? The article goes on to say, at the same time as it was being cut off from much of its potential brain power, black business also suffered the loss of its traditional base of black customers, especially in the retail sector. Shops that survived the humiliations of Jim Crow died like flies during the 1970s as blacks discovered the wonders of franchised foods, Safeway markets, and chain convenience stores. This is an article that was published in 1986, written by a guy named Joel Kotkin. You may be familiar with him. He also wrote a book called Tribes, which I've talked about on this show. But it was published in Inc. magazine. Now it goes on to say, quote, when I was growing up, we had black laundromats and drugstores, recalls Oakland accountant Herman Morris of his boyhood in Little Rock, Arkansas. But integration changed all of that. All of a sudden, hallelujah, you could work and shop with white people. People turned away from black economic institutions because that was a way of getting away from the past. That was true of all blacks to some degree, but middle-class blacks especially. It was like an insurmountable trade barrier had dissolved overnight, explains Robert Suggs, a researcher at the Joint Center for Political Studies in Washington, D.C. Quote, the traditional black business almost immediately lost its most affluent clientele, unquote. See what's happening now? Booker T. Washington writes his book lauding black businesses all over the country. And now here we are in '86 reflecting on what took place from 1965 through 1986, the reluctant entrepreneurs. And really what this is asking, this entire article, and I use this article in my class, Black Entrepreneurship at the University of Cincinnati, what this article is asking, or what issue or what question it's posing, is the same one we're talking about today. Are your dollars making sense? Do your dollars make sense? It's the same thing. Finally, a couple of paragraphs, and this is going to bring it home to us, and we'll get into this at the end of this. This turning away of customers severely undermined the market position of black entrepreneurs. According to television personality Tony Brown, from 1969 to 1984, the proportion of black income spent in black-owned businesses dropped from 13.5% to 7%. Black banks and insurance companies, once pillars of the community's economy, were sold or folded. Even such traditional bastions of black business as hair care products have watched as corporations like Revlon and Alberto Culver have increased their share of the black market. And I could add to that L'Oreal and others as well. You know what happened to the black hair care market. Finally, here is the paragraph that brings it home to Cincinnati. In Columbus, Ohio, for example, Singletary Plaza Mart, the nation's largest, let me say that again, the nation's largest black-owned superstore or supermarket, went out of business last year, that would be 1985, due to a lack of community patronage. Now, I think I've spoken about Singletary's Supermarket in Columbus, Ohio before. I've been there. I went up there in the 80s. We were doing some merchandising in Columbus at that store. And I actually went in the store, saw the store. You know, this is personal for me. It's not something I just read about. The article goes on to say, although blacks in Columbus spend, check this out, although blacks in Columbus spend $2.5 million each week on food, they couldn't be convinced to spend less than a tenth of it, or $200,000, to keep Singletary's market afloat. I could end the show right here, right? Because you know where I'm going with this. I'm going to read that again. Although blacks in Columbus spend $2.5 million each week on food, can you imagine that? They couldn't be convinced to spend less than a tenth of it, which would have been $200,000, to keep Singletary market afloat. Now, all Singletary's needed in their gross revenues was $200,000. Black people were spending $2.5 million a week on food. And Singletary's closed due to lack of support. And I would say due to the lack of support of black people, because Singletary's market was located right on Mount Vernon Avenue. Those of you familiar with Columbus, you know where that is. You know how many black people are over there. Now, what does that say about our dollars making sense? And how does that touch us, even though this article was written in 1986? How does that touch us today with the Kroger closing? People calling and saying what they're going to do. Oh, we can open up a store, we can do this, we can do that. Now, we know when it comes to black consumers supporting black businesses, we have a long way to go. We know that. Tony Brown gave some stats from 1969 to 1984 about our support dropping from 13% to 7%. The last census, in the last census, it was stated that black people own 1,197,000 businesses in this country, but they only employed 754,000. Those businesses only employed 754,000. The collective aggregate annual revenues for all of those businesses was less than $100 billion. Matter of fact, it was around $89 billion for all of those businesses. But yet, black consumers, all black people, had an income annually $750 billion. Are our dollars making sense? And this was just in the last census. I can't wait till this one comes out. It'll be a couple of years before the economic part of the census that they're taking in 2010 comes out. But I want to see it, see if we have improved, to see if our dollars have started making more sense than they were in 2000 when the last census was done. So this is a very interesting tie-in to what's going on here locally. Should we work to put a black-owned supermarket, if not at that location in Roseline or anywhere in this town or anywhere in Roseline or Bond Hill or Avondale? Should we do that? I remember when Aldi's closed, people got mad. Aldi's is still gone. I remember when Kroger's closed down on Lynn Street. A couple of people got mad, 2 or 3, nothing happened. IGA, Thriftway, all of those stores have closed, some of which were serving black people. I remember the place out in Pleasant Ridge, that, I don't know what they call it, Fresh Market Place or whatever it was, right there up from Ridge, in Pleasant Ridge. It lasted for a while. It used to be a supermarket, and when the supermarket closed, the people in the community said, well, let's turn it into a fresh market place, and I think they had a lot of produce in there and everything. I never went in, but it didn't last. I don't know if it lasted 3 years. It's not there now. So what are we to think, and what are we to do when it comes to replacing the store that we are so upset about having left Roseline? What are we going to do? Now, I know that some folks are not going to do anything but just complain about it. I've seen that in the past too. And some people are righteously standing against it, speaking out against it, demonstrating against it, and doing their part, because there are different roles and different parts for people to play. There was a big meeting about it at Woodward High School a couple of weeks ago. There's another meeting that's going to be held about it. But I'm wondering, what is going to be the final solution? What are we going to do with our dollars when it comes to solving what many have described as a huge problem, our senior citizens not being able to eat? Are our dollars going to start making sense when it comes to that? I hear a lot of people talking about a lot of different things, but I haven't heard anyone say, well, hey, let's invest in ourselves. Let's put some money together, and let's put some money on the table, and let's see what we can do about having our own store. I have heard conversations about putting together a co-op, a food co-op, and of course that takes some collective work and pooling some funds and rechanneling those funds, and that's a good idea too. Of course, we couldn't do it at that site. Kroger didn't own the building. They don't own the property. It's owned by, that whole shopping area is owned by another individual. But when it comes to having a supermarket, Singletary's Market is a prime example of what could happen if our dollars don't make any sense. If you're spending $2.5 million a week on food and you can't spend $200,000 at a black-owned supermarket, dollars not making any sense. Now, I have, since it started, I have, through my position as the Economic Development Chair of the NAACP Cincinnati branch under the authority and leadership of Christopher Smitherman, I've worked over the past about a month now, and this was well before the store closed in Roseline, to